When experts examined this 1915 Japanese imperial photograph, they saw exactly what they expected to see. A formal portrait of Empress Teimei, wife of Emperor Taisho, standing alone in ceremonial court dress before a painted screen depicting Mount Fuji. The composition was elegant, the lighting was impeccable, the subject was regal. For over a century, no one questioned what they were looking at. Then, in 2019, a conservation scientist turned on an infrared imaging array. What appeared behind the Empress had been deliberately erased, painted over, hidden. And what the hidden figure was clutching in her hands would expose a secret that the Japanese government has never officially acknowledged. Dr. Sarah Chen had spent 22 years examining historical photographs. As senior conservation scientist at the Smithsonian Institution's Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., she had authenticated images for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Palace Museum in Beijing, and the National Museum of Korea. She had written the definitive textbook on detecting forgeries in 19th-century East Asian photography. Her laboratory housed one of only 3 multispectral imaging systems in the world capable of revealing manipulations invisible to the naked eye. She had seen thousands of photographs cross her examination table. But in the spring of 2019, she received an assignment unlike any other. 8 years earlier, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake had devastated Japan's eastern coast. The disaster killed nearly 20,000 people and caused widespread destruction to cultural institutions. Among the casualties were hundreds of imperial photographs stored in the Japanese National Archives, images that had survived world wars and political upheavals, only to be damaged by floodwater and debris. Through a joint Smithsonian-Japan Cultural Preservation Initiative, 200 of these photographs were shipped to Dr. Chen's laboratory for specialized restoration treatment. The crates arrived in January 2019, each photograph carefully sealed in protective archival sleeves. Item number 447 was labeled simply, Empress Teimei, 1915 Formal Portrait. Dr. Chen removed it from its sleeve with gloved hands. The photograph was an 11 by 14-inch silver gelatin print, standard for imperial portraiture of that era. It showed the Empress in traditional junyato, the 12-layered ceremonial court robe, standing before an elaborately painted screen. Water damage had affected the lower left corner. Chemical deterioration had yellowed the edges. Standard age-related wear, nothing remarkable. And yet, something about the composition made Dr. Chen pause, something she couldn't quite name, a feeling she had learned over 2 decades never to ignore. Something was wrong with this photograph. At first, Dr. Chen couldn't articulate what bothered her. The photograph met every technical standard of Meiji and Taisho imperial portraiture. The lighting was professional, soft and diffused, designed to flatter royal subjects. The backdrop was appropriate, a hand-painted screen depicting Mount Fuji, a common motif in formal imperial photography. The Empress herself was composed, dignified, every element of her presentation carefully controlled. But she was positioned slightly off-center. Dr. Chen leaned closer to the photograph. In formal Japanese imperial photography, symmetry wasn't merely a preference. It was protocol. It was sacred. The emperor or empress occupied the exact mathematical center of the frame. This wasn't artistic choice. It was imperial law. The center represented divine authority. To position the sovereign anywhere else would have been unthinkable. Yet here was Empress Teimei, standing noticeably to the left of center. Dr. Chen's pulse quickened slightly. She pulled her magnification equipment from the drawer and positioned the photograph beneath the lens. She studied the painted backdrop behind the Empress's right shoulder, where the composition felt somehow heavy, unbalanced. The brushstrokes on the painted screen looked inconsistent. Most of the backdrop showed the natural aging pattern she would expect from a century-old photograph: uniform fatting, consistent chemical deterioration. But in one section, roughly the size and shape of a human figure, the aging pattern was different, slightly newer, slightly more deliberate. She had seen this before. Not often, perhaps a dozen times in her entire career, but she recognized it immediately. When you restore old photographs, she would later explain to colleagues, you develop an instinct for absence. You learn to see what's not there. You learn to recognize the shape of something that's been removed. Dr. Chen prepared the multispectral imaging array. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. Infrared first, then ultraviolet, then full spectrum analysis. The infrared image materialized on her screen. And Dr. Chen stopped breathing. There was a second figure in the photograph, standing directly behind the Empress, slightly to her right, exactly where the off-center composition now made perfect, devastating sense. Someone had been standing there. Someone had been erased. Dr. Chen gripped the edge of her desk. Her training told her to remain clinical, to document what she was seeing before drawing conclusions. But her hands were trembling as she increased the imaging resolution. The figure's outline sharpened. Female, approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall. Young, the proportions suggested late adolescence, perhaps 15 or 16 years old. She had been positioned precisely where a second subject would stand in a formal dual portrait. This wasn't damage. This wasn't deterioration. This was deliberate, meticulous, professional-grade erasure. The manipulation technique was consistent with 1920s-era photograph retouching, the kind of work that required specialized materials, extensive training, and considerable time. Whoever had done this had unlimited resources and absolute skill. The erasure had been painted over with such precision that it had remained undetected for more than a century. Dr. Chen adjusted the imaging parameters. The figure's clothing became visible. She felt her stomach drop. The erased woman was not wearing Japanese court dress. She was wearing a hybrid garment, elements of Korean royal hanbok combined with Japanese formal wear, a style Dr. Chen had never seen documented in any imperial photograph, a style that, according to everything she knew, should not exist. And then she saw the hands. The hidden figure was clutching something, a small object perhaps 2 inches across, held at waist level with both hands. As the enhancement continued, the object resolved into clarity. A jade seal, oval-shaped, carved with an intricate crest. Dr. Chen recognized it immediately. The royal emblem of the Korean Min clan, the most powerful noble family in Korean history, the family of the assassinated Queen Min. For a long moment, Dr. Chen simply stared at the screen, the implications cascading through her mind like falling dominoes. What had she found? This was not a damaged photograph. This was not accidental deterioration or careless storage or the natural decay of a century-old image. This was erasure, deliberate, systematic, authorized at the highest levels of Japanese imperial authority. Someone had looked at this photograph, a formal portrait of the Empress of Japan, and decided that the Korean woman standing beside her needed to disappear, not just from this image, from history itself. And that Korean woman had known it might happen, because she was holding proof of her identity, clutching it with both hands, positioned at her waist where the camera would capture it clearly. A jade seal bearing the crest of the Min clan, the most powerful, most persecuted noble family in Korean history. The family whose matriarch, Queen Min, had been assassinated by Japanese agents in 1895. This young woman had stood in the palace of her family's enemies, dressed in a costume that marked her as neither fully Korean nor fully Japanese, and she had made certain that if anyone ever found her, they would know exactly who she was. The questions multiplied in Dr. Chen's mind. Who was this erased figure? How did a Korean noblewoman end up standing beside the Japanese empress in an official portrait? What was so dangerous about her presence that the Imperial Household Agency had ordered her painted out of existence? And what had happened to her after the photograph was taken? Dr. Chen knew she needed answers. In the next few minutes, you'll see the first expert confirmation that this erasure was conducted by the Imperial Household Agency itself. By minute 12, you'll learn this young woman's name and exactly how old she was when she was taken from her family. And by the end of this video, you'll meet her living descendant and see what he has kept hidden for over 70 years. Dr. Chen's first call was to Tokyo. Dr. Hiroshi Watanabe, professor of photographic conservation at Tokyo University of the Arts, was the world's foremost authority on Meiji and Taisho-era imperial photography. He had spent 40 years studying the technical methods used by court photographers, the materials they employed, the protocols they followed. If anyone could authenticate the manipulation techniques Dr. Chen had discovered, it was him. She sent high-resolution scans of the original photograph alongside her multispectral imaging results. She included detailed notes on the chemical composition of the overpaint, the brushstroke patterns, the aging differentials she had observed. His response arrived within 48 hours. The skill of this erasure tells us something important, Dr. Watanabe wrote in his analysis. Whoever did this possessed unlimited resources and absolute authority. I have analyzed the chemical composition of the overpaint material. It matches compounds used exclusively by the Imperial Household Agency's Internal Conservation Department between 1918 and 1925. These materials were not commercially available. They were manufactured specifically for palace use. I'll put his full technical assessment on screen so you can read it yourself. Dr. Watanabe continued. Furthermore, the brushwork technique is consistent with methods taught only to conservators employed directly by the imperial household. This was not the work of a private collector attempting to modify a photograph. This was not a rogue photographer covering a mistake. This was state-sanctioned erasure, conducted at the highest levels of Japanese imperial authority. Only the Imperial Household Agency had access to these materials. Only they had the legal standing to alter an official portrait of the Empress. Dr. Chen now had confirmation of who had erased the figure. But she still didn't know who they had erased. She turned her attention to the clothing. The hybrid Korean-Japanese court dress was the key. No documentation existed of such a garment in any imperial photography archive. If she could identify what this clothing represented, she might be able to identify the woman who wore it. She contacted Dr. Soon-hee Park at Seoul National University, one of the world's leading scholars on Korean noble families under Japanese colonial rule. Dr. Park had spent 3 decades researching the experiences of Korean aristocrats during the occupation period. If anyone could explain this mysterious hybrid dress, it was her. Dr. Park's response came within hours, and it was not clinical. "I know exactly what you have found," she wrote. "I have spent my entire academic career searching for evidence like this. What you are describing is a shadow lady, a daughter of a Korean noble family who was held as a political hostage at the Japanese imperial court. These young women were forced to wear modified clothing that blended Korean and Japanese elements. It was meant to symbolize cultural integration, but in reality, it marked them as neither Korean nor Japanese. Suspended between identities, belonging to neither world." Dr. Park's email continued. "We have testimony about these shadow ladies. We have diary entries from Japanese noblewomen who served alongside them. We have fragmentary references in exile memoirs, but we have never had photographic proof. Until now." She attached 3 documents to her message. The first was a diary entry from 1918, written by Baroness Nabeshima Itsuko, a Japanese noblewoman who had served at the imperial court. The entry mentioned, almost in passing, the Korean girls who serve in silence. I'll put that on screen. The second document was a shipping manifest from October 1910, just 2 months after Japan's formal annexation of Korea. The manifest listed special passengers transported by ferry from Busan to Shimonoseki. Among the names, Min, female, age 11. The third was a letter written in formal, desperate Korean. It was addressed to the Japanese Residency General from a man named Min Young-chan. The letter begged, pleaded, for any news about his daughter's condition. Dr. Chen stared at the name. Min, the same clan whose royal seal appeared in the erased figure's hands. She was getting closer to the truth. To understand what Dr. Chen had uncovered, you need to understand what Japan did to Korea's noble families after 1910. When Japan formally annexed Korea in August of that year, they faced an immediate political problem. The Korean aristocracy, the Yeonbun class, wielded enormous influence over the population. These families had wealth, education, and centuries of social authority. They could organize resistance movements. They could fund uprisings. They could rally millions of Koreans against Japanese occupation. Japan needed leverage. They needed insurance. The solution they devised was elegant in its cruelty and devastating in its effectiveness. Beginning in October 1910, the Imperial Household Agency began quietly selecting daughters of prominent Korean noble families for what they called the honor of serving the Empress. These girls, typically between the ages of 10 and 16, were transported to the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. They were given Japanese names. They were dressed in hybrid court clothing that stripped them of their Korean identity. They were forbidden from communicating with their families, except through heavily censored letters. They were, in every meaningful sense, hostages. Their presence in Tokyo served a single purpose: to ensure their father's obedience. Any resistance to Japanese rule, any support for independence movements, any hint of disloyalty, and the girls would face consequences. The program was never officially documented. The young women were registered under Section 14 of the Imperial Household Law, a bureaucratic category originally created to cover European governesses and music instructors. Their Korean names disappeared from official records. Their identities were erased even before the photographs were altered. And when the program became politically inconvenient, after Korean independence protests erupted in 1919, the photographs were erased too. Dr. Margaret Brennan, a Yale professor specializing in colonial photography and visual propaganda, explained the logic to Dr. Chen during a subsequent consultation. Erasing someone from a photograph is not merely about hiding their presence, Dr. Brennan said. It is about retroactively declaring that they never existed. It is the most absolute form of historical violence. You are not just removing a person from a moment in time. You are removing them from time itself. The Min clan was a particular target for this violence. The Mins had been the most powerful noble family in late Joseon Korea, and in 1895, Japanese agents had assassinated the clan's most prominent member, Empress Myeongseong, known to history as Queen Min. The murder galvanized Korean resistance for generations. Taking Min daughters as hostages wasn't just practical politics. It was revenge. It was humiliation. It was the Japanese Empire saying, "We killed your queen. Now your daughters serve ours." Dr. Chen now understood the terrible significance of what she had found. That jade seal clutched in the erased figure's hands wasn't just jewelry. It was identity. It was defiance. It was a teenage girl holding onto the symbol of her family while standing in the palace of her oppressors. Now that you understand what this photograph represents, what I'm about to show you becomes even more devastating. Because Dr. Chen was about to discover exactly who this young woman was, her name, her family, and what had been done to her. Dr. Chen now had a clan name. She had a shipping manifest with a specific date. She had a gender and an age, Female, 11 years old, October 1910. She needed a name. Dr. Park at Seoul National University had been searching through Korean court records, the ones that had survived Japanese colonial destruction. This was no simple task. When Japanese forces retreated from Korea in 1945, they had deliberately burned most noble family registries. Generations of genealogical records, birth certificates, marriage documents, reduced to ash in a final act of historical erasure. But some records had survived. Some had been hidden by loyal servants who understood what was coming. Some had been smuggled to Shanghai by Korean exiles fleeing the occupation. Some had been buried in temple grounds and recovered decades later by historians who knew where to look. In the Min clan registry, preserved at the Independence Hall of Korea in Cheonan, Dr. Park finally found what she was searching for. Her name was Min Yeon. Born March 3, 1899, in Hanseong, the Korean name for Seoul before Japanese occupation renamed it. She was the second child and eldest daughter of Min Young-chan, who had served as Vice Minister of Education under the Korean Empire before annexation stripped him of his position and his power. Her mother was Lady Yeon, daughter of a prominent Confucian scholar family with centuries of intellectual lineage. Yeon had an elder brother named Min Tae-ho and a younger sister named Min Soo-jin. I'll put the registry entry on screen so you can see it yourself. When the 1915 photograph was taken, Min Yeon was 16 years old. When she was taken from her family and transported to Tokyo, she was 11. Dr. Chen sat back from her computer screen and pressed her palms against her eyes. The documents Dr. Park had compiled painted a picture that was devastating in its specificity. Yeon had not been randomly selected from among Korea's noble daughters. Her family had been targeted precisely because of who they were. The Min clan had produced Empress Myeongseong, known to Koreans as Queen Min, the ruler whose fierce resistance to Japanese influence had made her a symbol of Korean independence. In October 1895, Japanese agents and soldiers had broken into Gyeongbokgung Palace in the dead of night. They had dragged the queen from her chambers. They had murdered her in front of her attendants, and then they had burned her body to destroy the evidence of their crime. The assassination shocked the world. It galvanized Korean resistance for generations, and it made the Min clan the most dangerous family in Korea, dangerous to Japan. 15 years later, Japan took their revenge. Min Young-chan's son, Tae-ho, was taken first. In 1909, 1 year before formal annexation, he was sent to Tokyo as a student, a transparent euphemism for hostage. Then, in October 1910, just 2 months after Japan formally absorbed Korea as a colony, they came for Yeon. The letter Dr. Park had found, the desperate plea from Min Young-chan to the Japanese Residency General, was dated November 1911. 1 full year after his daughter had been taken from him. He was begging for any news of her condition, any confirmation that she was alive and well. The letter bore a stamp in Japanese characters. It read, "No response required." Dr. Chen closed her laptop. She walked to the window of her laboratory and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the Washington, D.C. skyline without really seeing it. She had found a name. She had found a face, hidden for more than a century, but now visible through modern imaging technology. She had found a story. And it was about to get much, much worse. Dr. Park sent one final document. It arrived in Dr. Chen's inbox late on a Thursday evening, attached to an email with a subject line that read simply, "I'm sorry to send you this." The document was an internal memorandum from the Imperial Household Agency, dated 1920. It had been partially recovered from fire-damaged archives after World War II, one of thousands of documents that Japanese officials had attempted to destroy before Allied forces could seize them. The memo was addressed to the Director of Palace Administration, The subject line read, "Ray, removal of foreign elements from official photographs." I'll put this on screen so you can read the exact language they used. The memo instructed palace staff to systematically review all formal portraits from the period 1910-1919 and to eliminate visual evidence of temporary foreign personnel whose presence is no longer politically advantageous. No longer politically advantageous. That was the phrase they used to describe teenage girls who had been torn from their families and held captive for years, not no longer present, not returned to their homes, not even deceased. No longer politically advantageous. As if these young women were furniture that had gone out of style, as if their existence could be reduced to a question of political convenience. Dr. Chen thought about what this memo meant in human terms. Yeon had stood in that photograph at 16 years old. She had been positioned beside the Empress, visible, documented, real. She had clutched her family's jade seal in her hands, a small act of defiance that she must have known might cost her everything. She had ensured that if anyone ever found this image, they would know exactly who she was. And then, sometime between 1920 and 1923, someone had decided she should cease to exist. They painted over her face. They erased her hands. They obliterated the jade seal that connected her to her murdered ancestor. They transformed a dual portrait into a solo image and filed it away as if Min Soo-yeon had never stood there at all. She was 11 years old when they took her from her mother. The shipping manifest had listed her simply as Min, female, age 11. No first name, no family designation, no farewell. Just cargo. For 9 years, Soo-yeon had lived in that palace, forbidden to speak her native Korean, forbidden to contact her family except through censored letters that palace officials read before forwarding, dressed in hybrid clothing that marked her as neither Japanese nor Korean, suspended between two identities, belonging fully to neither. She was a ghost in the imperial court, and then they made her a ghost in history too. But Soo-yeon's story does not end in that palace. Because while she was serving in silence, a network was forming in the shadows. Japanese liberals who could not look away, Korean nationalists who refused to accept occupation, palace servants who risked everything to help young women they barely knew. They called themselves the Chrysanthemum Network. And they were planning something extraordinarily dangerous. They were planning to get the shadow ladies out. The Chrysanthemum Network took its name from the imperial seal of Japan. The 16-petal chrysanthemum was the exclusive symbol of the Japanese imperial family, sacred, protected by law, untouchable by common citizens. For a secret resistance organization to claim this name was an act of deliberate subversion. They were hiding in plain sight, using the empire's own symbol against it. The network brought together an unlikely alliance of conspirators. Setsuko Ishikawa was the widow of Takuboku Ishikawa, one of Japan's most celebrated poets, who had died of tuberculosis in 1912. After her husband's death, Setsuko had taken work as a seamstress in the imperial palace, a position that gave her access to the inner quarters where the shadow ladies lived. She passed messages hidden in laundry deliveries, folded into the seams of garments she repaired. Kim Kyu-sik was a Korean independence activist who operated from a boarding house in Tokyo's Kanda district. He coordinated escape routes that stretched from the Japanese capital through Nagasaki to Shanghai, where the Korean provisional government in exile had established its headquarters. He never met the women he helped rescue. He couldn't risk it. Countess Hayashi Fumiko was a Japanese noblewoman with connections to liberal political circles and progressive intellectual movements. She provided money and safe houses, resources that could not be traced back to her without destroying her family's reputation and possibly costing her life. And there was Pak Yeol, then just a young student in his early 20s, who would later become one of the most famous Korean anarchists in history. In 1915 and 1916, he served as a courier, carrying coded messages between palace contacts and the outside network, traveling by train and foot through a surveillance state that would have executed him if he had been caught. Dr. Chen found references to the Chrysanthemum Network in Korean exile testimonies collected in Shanghai between 1920 and 1925. I'll put several of these primary sources on screen. The testimonies describe the network's methods in careful, coded detail. Messages hidden in food deliveries that reached palace kitchens. Forged travel documents that identified Korean women as Japanese citizens with family in rural prefectures. A chain of safe houses stretching from Tokyo through Nagasaki to Shanghai. And most crucially, timing. The network learned to time escape attempts to coincide with major state events. Imperial weddings, state funerals, diplomatic visits, any occasion when palace security was focused outward on public ceremonies rather than inward on palace operations. But the obstacles were enormous. The Kenpeitai, Japan's military police, maintained constant surveillance on known Korean nationalists and liberal Japanese intellectuals. Palace servants were required to report any suspicious activity, any unauthorized contact with the outside world. The punishment for failing to report was imprisonment. The punishment for active collaboration was death. And the most effective weapon in the empire's arsenal wasn't guards or walls or surveillance. It was the families back in Korea. Any escape attempt, if discovered, would result in punishment, not for the young woman who ran, but for her parents, her siblings, her entire extended family. The hostage system had been designed with this cruelty at its center. Running didn't just risk your own life. It meant condemning everyone you loved. For 9 years, Yeon stayed in the palace. For 9 years, she served in silence, wore the hybrid clothing that marked her as neither Korean nor Japanese, and obeyed every rule designed to break her spirit. And then on March 1, 1919, everything changed. In Korea, millions of people took to the streets in what would become known as the March 1st movement, the largest independence protest in Korean history. Men and women, students and farmers, merchants and monks, they marched through the streets of Seoul and Pyongyang and hundreds of smaller cities and villages, waving Korean flags and demanding independence. Japanese authorities were overwhelmed. Every soldier, every police officer, every intelligence agent in the empire was suddenly focused on suppressing the uprising. And for 4 chaotic days, the security around the imperial palace in Tokyo was stretched to its breaking point. The Chrysanthemum Network saw their opportunity. On March 5, 1919, 4 days after the protests began in Korea, Yeon collapsed during morning duties. The palace physician who examined her, a man whose name appears in surviving testimonies only as Dr. K, diagnosed severe tuberculosis symptoms. He recommended immediate transfer to a hospital in Tokyo for treatment and isolation to prevent the spread of infection to other palace staff, and more importantly, to the imperial family itself. The symptoms were fake. Dr. K had provided Yeon with medication that mimicked the early stages of tuberculosis, elevated fever, persistent cough, fatigue that made it difficult to stand. The deception was dangerous. If discovered, it would mean execution for Dr. K and punishment beyond imagination for Yeon's family in Korea. But the network had calculated correctly. In the chaos of responding to the March 1st movement, no one questioned a sick servant being removed from the palace. For 7 days, Yeon waited in a Tokyo hospital room. Every footstep in the corridor could have been Kenpeitai officers coming to drag her back to the palace. Every knock at the door could have been discovery and death. She was 20 years old. She had turned 20 just days earlier, on March 3rd, and she was betting everything on a network of strangers she had communicated with only through coded messages hidden in laundry. On March 12th, Countess Hayashi arrived at the hospital. She carried transfer papers stating that the patient, registered under her Japanese name, Akiko, was being moved to a sanitarium in Nagasaki for continued treatment and recovery. The documents bore official seals. They had cost the Countess nearly her entire savings to forge. The train journey took 14 hours. Yeon traveled in a private compartment, wearing Japanese clothing, her face covered with a medical mask as if to prevent the spread of disease. At every station, Yokohama, Shizuoka, Nagoya, Osaka, Hiroshima, she expected soldiers to board the train and demand her papers. At every stop, she prepared herself for the end. The soldiers never came. In Nagasaki, there was no sanitarium waiting for her. There was a Chinese merchant ship called the Tianjin Star, scheduled to depart for Shanghai at dawn on March 18th. Kim Kyusik had arranged passage. Yeon would be hidden among the cargo, concealed in wooden crates supposedly containing textile machinery. She spent 18 hours in the hold of that ship, in absolute darkness, listening to the engines and the waves, not knowing if she would be discovered at any moment. She later wrote that she held her jade seal, the same one visible in the 1915 photograph, pressed against her chest the entire journey, the last piece of her identity, the last connection to her family. On March 19, 1919, the Tianjin Star docked in Shanghai. Kim Kyusik was waiting on the pier. Yeon walked off that ship as a free woman for the first time in 9 years. She was 20 years old. She had escaped an empire. She was one of only 7 shadow ladies known to have made it out. The fates of the others, the dozens of Korean daughters who served in silence in the imperial palace, remain largely unknown to this day. Their photographs were erased. Their names were erased. Their very existence was erased from history. But Min Yeon had survived. And she was only getting started. When Min Yeon stepped off the Tianjin Star onto the docks of Shanghai on March 19, 1919, she was 20 years old, and she owned nothing except the clothes on her back and the jade seal pressed against her heart. She had no money. She had no identity documents, at least none that bore her real name. She had no way to contact her family in Korea without endangering them. She had spent 9 years as a ghost in the Japanese Imperial Palace, and now she was a ghost in a foreign city, surrounded by strangers who spoke a language she barely understood. But she was free, and she had work to do. The Korean Provisional Government had established its headquarters in Shanghai's French Concession, organizing the independence movement from exile. Within 2 weeks of her arrival, Yeon had made contact with the leadership. Within a month, she was working as a translator and intelligence analyst. Her years in the Imperial Palace had given her something invaluable: first-hand knowledge of Japanese court protocols, government structures, and the personalities of the officials who ran them. She knew which ministers were ambitious and which were cautious. She knew the hierarchies, the rivalries, the pressure points. She had spent 9 years listening while everyone around her assumed she couldn't understand. They had underestimated her. It would be their greatest mistake. Korean Provisional Government records from 1919, preserved at the Independence Hall of Korea, document her arrival and her immediate contributions to the resistance. I'll put that archival entry on screen. For 6 years, Yeon worked in Shanghai. In 1924, she married Park Jun-ho, a fellow independence activist who had escaped Japanese imprisonment 3 years earlier. They would have 3 children together, 2 sons and a daughter, all of whom survived to adulthood. But Yeon could not stay still, could not settle into safety while her homeland remained occupied. From 1925 to 1932, she served as an underground courier, traveling between Shanghai and Manchuria along routes that Japanese intelligence agencies were constantly trying to uncover. She carried messages, money, and documents to resistance cells scattered across northeastern China. The work was extraordinarily dangerous. Several of her colleagues were captured, tortured, and executed. Yeon herself was stopped and questioned by Japanese military police on at least 4 occasions. She was never arrested. She had learned during those 9 years of palace service how to be invisible when she needed to be. After 1932, when Japanese forces invaded Manchuria and the courier routes became too dangerous, Yeon shifted her focus to education. She taught at Korean exile schools in China, helping to preserve Korean language and culture for children who had never seen their homeland. She spent the war years in Chongqing, where the provisional government had relocated to escape Japanese advances. She never stopped working for independence. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. Korea was free. Yeon was 46 years old. She had spent 35 years, her entire adult life, fighting for this moment. She returned briefly to Korea, to the country she had been stolen from as a child, walking on Korean soil for the first time since she was 11 years old. But Korea was divided now. The Americans occupied the South, the Soviets the North, and war was already brewing. In 1952, as the Korean War devastated the peninsula, Yeon and her family emigrated to the United States. She settled in Los Angeles, and at age 56, remarkably, she began a new career. She became a lecturer in Korean history at UCLA, teaching American students about the culture and history of a country most of them couldn't find on a map. She taught until 1975, when she retired at 76 years old. In her final years, she worked on documenting the stories of the other shadow ladies, the ones who hadn't escaped, the ones whose fates remained unknown. She interviewed survivors. She corresponded with historians. She wrote a 342-page memoir in Korean titled The Erased Ones. Min Yeon died on September 3, 1987, in Los Angeles, California. She was 88 years old. She had outlived the empire that tried to erase her. She lived to see the end of Japanese colonial rule. She lived to see Korean independence, though the peninsula remained divided. She lived to see her grandchildren graduate from American universities, speaking English as their first language but carrying Korean names she had chosen for them. But she did not live to see her photograph restored. She did not live to see her existence officially acknowledged by the government that had tried to erase her. In her memoir, written in 1978, she included a passage that Dr. Chen would later read with tears streaming down her face. Painted over my face in that photograph the way they tried to paint over all of us. They erased my eyes, my hands, the jade seal my mother pressed into my palm the day they took me. They thought if they removed our images, they removed our existence, but I am still here. My children are still here. My grandchildren are still here. And one day, I believe this with all my heart, someone will look at that photograph and wonder why the Empress stands so strangely off-center. One day, someone will find me. One day, they will see what was hidden. If you're still watching, you understand why this story matters. But here's where it becomes personal. Because someone had been waiting for over 100 years for exactly this moment to arrive. Someone who had grown up hearing stories about a great-grandmother who survived the unsurvivable. Someone who possessed evidence that Dr. Chen had never dared to hope existed. Dr. Sarah Chen presented her preliminary findings at the annual conference of the Association for Asian Studies in March 2023. The presentation was scheduled for a small breakout session, one of dozens running simultaneously at the Boston Convention Center. Dr. Chen had expected perhaps 30 or 40 attendees, mostly specialists in photographic conservation and East Asian colonial history. The room was standing room only. Word had spread through academic networks in the weeks leading up to the conference. A photograph that proved the existence of the Shadow Ladies program. Multispectral imaging that revealed a century-old erasure. Evidence that the Japanese imperial authorities had systematically removed Korean hostages from historical records. By the time Dr. Chen finished her presentation, historians were already composing emails to colleagues around the world. A journalist covering the conference for The Atlantic wrote an article with the headline, "The Erased Women of the Japanese Imperial Court." The piece went viral within academic circles and spread quickly beyond them, shared on social media by Korean diaspora communities, Asian American advocacy groups, and historians who had spent their careers searching for evidence exactly like this. 3 weeks after the article was published, Dr. Chen received an email through Georgetown University's academic network. The subject line read, "I believe you found my great-grandmother." Dr. Chen stared at those words for a full minute before she clicked to open the message. The email was from Dr. James Min Yeon in Korean, a professor of international relations at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He was 47 years old. He specialized in East Asian diplomatic history, with a particular focus on Korea-Japan relations in the 20th century. And he was, he wrote, the great-grandson of Min Yeon. James explained that he had grown up hearing fragments of what he called halmoni stories, halmoni being the Korean word for grandmother. His mother, Dr. Grace Min Park, was Yeon's granddaughter. She had passed down the stories she remembered from her childhood. A great-grandmother who had escaped from Japan, who had worked for Korean independence, who had kept a photograph that she said the world wasn't ready to see. Like many third-generation Korean Americans, James had grown up feeling somewhat disconnected from these stories. They seemed distant, historical, belonging to another era. He had pursued his own academic career, built his own life, treated his family history as interesting background rather than urgent reality. That changed in 2018, when his grandmother Grace died. While sorting through her possessions, James found a box his grandmother had labeled with his great-grandmother's handwriting. Inside were documents, letters, and a sealed envelope with words written in Korean that James had to ask a colleague to translate. The words read, "For when they are ready to see." James had not opened the envelope. He didn't know why. Something had stopped him, a sense that the moment wasn't right, that he needed to understand more before he understood this. Then his cousin in Seoul had sent him the Atlantic article. "This is halmoni," she had written. "This is her story, James. They found her." James reached out to Dr. Chen that same day. Their first video call lasted 4 hours. By the end, both of them were crying. Because James didn't just have family stories. He had documents. He had artifacts. He had his great-grandmother's handwritten memoir, all 342 pages of it. And he had the envelope. On June 15, 2023, Dr. James Min traveled to Washington, D.C. He met Dr. Chen at the Smithsonian Conservation Laboratory on a warm summer morning, carrying a weathered manila envelope that had traveled from Tokyo to Shanghai to Los Angeles to a storage box in his grandmother's closet. On the front, in handwriting that Dr. Chen would later authenticate as Min Yeon's, were those same words. "For when they are ready to see." James's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope for the first time. Inside was a photograph. The same composition as the imperial portrait Dr. Chen had been studying for months. The same painted screen depicting Mount Fuji. The same Empress Teimei in her ceremonial 12-layered court robe. But this photograph had not been altered. Standing beside the Empress, clearly visible, exactly where Dr. Chen's multispectral imaging had predicted, was a young woman. She had dark, determined eyes that looked directly into the camera, directly through time, across more than a century, into this moment. She wore the hybrid Korean-Japanese court dress. Her posture was straight, dignified, defiant, and in her hands, clutched at waist level exactly where the jade seal had appeared in the enhanced imaging, was a small oval object carved with an intricate crest. It was Min Soo-yeon, an erased, unaltered reel. She obtained this photograph in 1952, James explained, his voice unsteady. A former palace servant who had sympathized with the shadow ladies had kept an unaltered copy hidden for decades. When Soo-yeon fled Korea during the war, this woman smuggled the photograph to her. My great-grandmother kept it for 35 years. My grandmother kept it for another 35. And now. He couldn't finish the sentence. Dr. Chen was crying too hard to respond. James reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the laboratory table beside both photographs, the erased imperial version and the hidden family original. It was a jade seal. Small, oval, carved from green nephrite with the intricate crest of the Min clan. The same seal visible in Soo-yeon's hands in 1915. The same seal she had clutched during 9 years of captivity, carried onto the Tianjin Star, protected through decades of exile and war and immigration. The same seal her mother had pressed into her palm on the day they took her, whispering words that Soo-yeon had never forgotten. Remember who you are. She had kept it her entire life. And now her great-grandson was placing it beside the photograph that proved she had existed. Over the following weeks, Dr. Chen's laboratory conducted extensive authentication testing. The two photographs were confirmed to have been taken within seconds of each other. Same camera, same angle, same lighting conditions, same moment in time. The erasure in the imperial photograph was dated, through chemical analysis, to between 1920 and 1923, consistent with the Imperial Household Agency memo ordering the removal of foreign elements. The jade seal was examined by gemologists specializing in East Asian artifacts. The nephrite was consistent with Korean sources. The carving style matched late Joseon dynasty craftsmanship. The Min clan crest was authentic. 108 years after Min Soo-yeon stood beside the Empress of Japan, her existence was finally proven beyond any possible doubt. James read aloud from his great-grandmother's memoir, the passage that would later appear on the wall of the museum exhibition. I was 11 years old when I last saw my mother. She whispered to me, "Remember who you are. They can take your name, your language, your clothing. They cannot take your blood." I held on to those words for 9 years in that palace. I hold on to them still. I will hold on to them until I die. And my children will hold on to them after me, and their children after them. We are still here. We will always be here. They erased our faces. They could not erase our existence. Today, the original unaltered photograph of Min Soo-yeon standing beside Empress Teimei is on loan from the Min family to the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History in Seoul. Thousands of visitors see it every week. Many of them stand before the image for long minutes, studying the face of a 16-year-old girl who refused to be forgotten. The restored imperial photograph, with the erasure revealed through multispectral imaging, remains at the Smithsonian Institution, pending ongoing discussions with the Japanese National Archives regarding its permanent disposition. Those discussions have been, according to sources familiar with them, difficult. The jade seal of the Min clan has been retained by the family. James wears it on a chain around his neck now, a habit he developed without consciously deciding to. It has been loaned to several exhibitions, always with a family member present. And Soo-yeon's memoir, The Erased Ones, is being prepared for publication by the University of Hawaii Press. The English translation is expected to be released in late 2025, 115 years after Soo-yeon was taken from her family, and nearly 4 decades after her death. In March 2024, a joint exhibition opened simultaneously at the National Museum of Korea in Seoul and the Smithsonian's Freer Gallery in Washington. The exhibition is called Hidden Figures, the Shadow Ladies of the Japanese Imperial Court. James Min attended both openings. At the sole ceremony, standing before a room packed with journalists, historians, government officials, and descendants of other Korean noble families, James delivered remarks that have since been translated into 14 languages. My great-grandmother spent her whole life being told she didn't exist, that her suffering never happened, that there was no proof. Officials denied it, governments denied it, history books were silent. She kept that photograph hidden for over 30 years, waiting. Not for justice she knew that might never come. Not for revenge, she had no interest in hatred. She waited for acknowledgement. She waited for someone to finally say, "You were there, we see you now." James paused to steady himself. This photograph gives her that. It gives all of them that. The shadow ladies whose names we know and the ones whose names were lost forever. The girls who escaped and the girls who didn't. The daughters who came home and the daughters who never did. We see you now. Finally, after 108 years, we see you. Since the discovery was announced, descendants of 4 other shadow ladies have come forward with their own family stories and evidence. Dr. Chen's ongoing research has identified possible erasures in 23 additional imperial photographs from the 1910-1920 period. Restoration and analysis work is underway. James Min has begun compiling a registry of the known shadow ladies and their fates. As of this recording, he has documented 31 names. He believes there may have been as many as 50. The Japanese Imperial Household Agency has officially declined to comment on the photograph or its implications. They have not, however, contested its authenticity. Dr. Chen has returned to her laboratory at the Smithsonian. She continues to examine the photographs entrusted to her care, looking for what others have missed, seeing what was hidden. They erased her face, Dr. Chen said recently, standing before the restored image. They erased her hands. They erased the seal of her family. They thought they had erased her from history. She paused. They were wrong. Somewhere in an archive, in an attic, in an estate sale you might walk past next weekend, there are photographs waiting. Photographs with secrets. Photographs with erasures. Photographs with people who were removed, painted over, cut out, forgotten, by those who believed they had the power to decide who would be remembered and who would disappear. Min Yeon waited 108 years to be found. Her family kept her photograph hidden for 70 more, waiting for the technology that would prove what had been done, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough. What photographs are in your family? What faces might be hidden in your history? What stories are waiting in boxes and albums and forgotten drawers, preserved by people who believed that someday someone would be ready to see? Tell me in the comments, because every family has a story. Every family has someone whose voice was silenced, whose face was hidden, whose existence was denied. And sometimes, all it takes is the right question, the right technology, and the willingness to look at what was always there. If this story moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'm documenting more hidden histories like this one, evidence buried in photographs, documents, and artifacts that change how we understand the past. Stories of people who were erased and the descendants who brought them back. Min Yeon believed that someday, someone would look at her photograph and wonder why the Empress stood so strangely off-center. She was right. They erased her face. They could not erase her existence.